Apple warns Trump's China tariffs will boost its product prices. Apple has warned the proposed U.S. tariffs on $us $200 billion worth of products imported from China will raise prices for some of its popular consumer goods such as the Apple Watch and AirPods headphones, and that's before counting in President Donald Trump's latest salvo in the trade war. The Mac Mini desktop computer, Apple Pencil stylus accessory for iPads, various chargers and adapters, and tooling equipment used to manufacture and design some products in the U.S. will also be affected, the California-based company told the Office of U.S. Trade Representative in a letter dated September 5. The letter did not mention the iPhone, which accounted for about two-thirds of Apple's $229 billion in revenue in its most recent fiscal year. It also made no mention of the iPad, which brought in $19.2 billion in sales in the most recent year, or most of its Mac computers, which generated $25.8 billion. The U.S. has imposed $50 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods, with another $200 billion in the final stages. The public had until Thursday to comment on the administration's plan. Meanwhile, Trump on Friday said he's ready to go all in and is considering another $267 billion of tariffs on China, which analysts said will affect virtually every category of consumer goods to retaliate against what he calls unfair trade practices. Our concern with these tariffs is that the U.S. will be hardest hit, and that will result in lower U.S. growth and competitiveness, and higher prices for U.S. consumers, Apple said in its letter. Loading. Apple outlined how the company's operations and products will be affected by the tariffs. Its shares, which had earlier gained 1%, fell about 0.8% to close at $221.30 on Friday. The company said the tariffs would show up as a tax on U.S. consumers and increase the cost of Apple products that our customers have come to rely on in their daily lives. Apple Chief Executive Officer Tim Cook earlier this year told Trump tariffs were not the right approach. In the letter, Apple asks the U.S. government to reconsider these measures and work to find other, more effective solutions that leave the U.S. economy and U.S. consumer stronger and healthier than ever before. Beyond the core products, Apple said accessories, like the HomePod speaker, some Beats speakers, airport and time capsule internet routers, the Magic Mouse and Magic Trackpad, and leather cases for the iPhone, iPad, MacBook, and Apple Pencil would be affected. It said some of the parts it relies on for product development, including processors and research equipment, would also be hit by the tariffs. In pushing back on the proposal, Apple said it bought more $50 billion worth of components from US-based suppliers last year, and that it's the largest U.S. corporate taxpayer. It also said that every Apple product contains parts or materials from the United States and is made with equipment from US-based suppliers. Earlier this year, the company said that as part of tax reform it would spend $350 billion in the U.S. over the next 5 years. Apple generated $9.6 billion in sales in China in the fiscal third quarter, accounting for 18% of its total revenue in the period. Intel, the world's second-largest chip maker, weighed in supporting Apple's opposition to the tariffs and broadening the argument. Computer and phone makers are involved in a global supply chain that includes Chinese manufacturing, and that can't be easily excluded without harm to U.S. companies, Intel said in a letter to the trade representative. The U.S.'s ability to continue to dominate telecommunications technology, including the upcoming fifth-generation phone networks, will be hampered by the levy on imports from China, it argued. Proposed China tariffs could raise prices for Apple Watch, AirPods, HomePod, and more. The Trump administration's plan to add $200 billion worth of tariffs on products made in China could force Apple to raise prices on some of its most popular products, including the Apple Watch, Apple Pencil, and AirPods. Apple's growing concern about the tariffs is mentioned in a September 5 letter sent to the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, according to Bloomberg. In the letter, Apple explains, "Our concern with these tariffs is that the U.S. will be hardest hit, and that will result in lower U.S. growth and competitiveness, and higher prices for U.S. consumers." Since the beginning of the year, the U.S. government has already imposed $50 billion worth of tariffs on goods made in China, with an additional $200 billion now being finalized. Besides the Apple products mentioned above, the second package would target the Mac Mini, various chargers and adapters and tooling equipment that the company uses to make and design some products in the U.S. More trouble could be brewing. However, the Trump administration is now considering another $267 billion in tariffs on China, which could affect all categories of consumer goods, including iPhone and iPad. The tariffs are part of a growing trade war currently showing no signs of slowing down between the countries that represent Apple's two largest consumer markets, the US and China. Back in the spring, Apple CEO Tim Cook met with President Trump about his approach to China. At the time, Cook called the trade policies in China problematic. Hopefully, things will improve on this front soon. Otherwise, the cost of Apple products could be going up very soon. Apple says U.S. tariffs on China would hit a wide range of products. Apple laid out the impact on its products of the Trump administration's proposed tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods in an unsigned letter it submitted on Wednesday to U.S. officials as part of a public comment period. A wide range of Apple Inc. products including the Apple Watch would be affected by proposed U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, the company told U.S. trade officials, but gave no sign of an impact on its iPhone cash cow. Apple did not disclose specific revenues for most of the affected products, but of those, the Apple Watch may be the biggest seller. It brought in about $6.1 billion in revenue last year, according to an estimate from analyst firm Bernstein. That represents a small portion of Apple's $229 billion in overall sales. Apple laid out the impact on its products of the Trump administration's proposed tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods in an unsigned letter it submitted on Wednesday to U.S. officials as part of a public comment period. On Friday, U.S. President Donald Trump, speaking aboard Air Force One, said that he has tariffs on an additional $267 billion in Chinese goods ready to go on short notice, if I want. Cell phones, the biggest U.S. import from China, have so far been spared, but would be hit if Trump activates the new $267 billion tariff list. AirPods headphones, some of Apple's Beats headphones, and its new HomePod smart speaker also face levies as part of the proposed tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods, according to the letter submitted on Wednesday. Our concern with these tariffs is that the U.S. will be hardest hit, and that will result in lower U.S. growth and competitiveness, and higher prices for U.S. consumers, Apple said in the letter. Apple did not respond to requests for comment. The letter did not mention the iPhone, which accounted for about two-thirds of Apple's $229 billion in revenue in its most recent fiscal year. The letter also made no mention of the iPad, which brought in $19.2 billion in sales in the most recent year, or most of its Mac computers, which generated $25.8 billion. Apple did say its Mac Mini, a low-priced computer that comes without a keyboard or mouse, would be affected. Many Apple accessories, such as mice, keyboards, chargers, and even leather covers for iPhones and iPads would face tariffs, Apple said. Reuters reported in July that the Apple Watch was likely to be affected by the tariffs. Shares of Apple closed down 0.8% in regular Nasdaq trade on Friday, and slipped another 1% in extended trading. Apple also said that computer parts for its U.S. operations would be hit by the tariffs. The company said that main logic boards with microprocessing units could face levies, along with equipment used for research and development. On Apple's most recent earnings call in July, Chief Executive Officer Tim Cook said the company could face such tariffs related to data centers. In its letter, Apple argued that the way U.S. trade officials calculate the U.S. trade balance, attributing the entire value of a product to a country, like China, where final assembly happens, fails to reflect the true value that Apple generates in the United States. The company noted it spent $50 billion with 9,000 U.S. suppliers in its most recent fiscal year, including Texas-based chip firm Finisar Corp. And Kentucky-based Corning Inc. Given the balance of Apple's economic footprint, the burden of the proposed tariffs will fall much more heavily on the United States and on China, Apple said in its letter. The technology sector is one of the biggest potential losers in the proposed $200 billion tariff list. Fitness tracker maker Fitbit said it would be hit by tariffs, and chip maker Intel Corp said the levies could slow down the adoption of 5G networks, the next generation of wireless data technology for phones and other devices. Trump threatens additional tariffs on $267 billion of Chinese goods. U.S. President Donald Trump threatened Friday to impose higher tariffs on an additional $267 billion of Chinese goods on short notice. Speaking with reporters on Air Force One during a midterm election campaign trip, Trump said he was ready to go on the additional tariffs if I want. Those levies would come on top of current tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese goods and pending tariffs on $200 billion in goods that the Trump administration has been preparing. If Trump follows through his threats, it would mean virtually all of China's exports to the U.S. would be subject to higher duties. Trump said the tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods could take place very soon depending on what happens with them. The office of the U.S. Trade Representative finished accepting comments Thursday on the proposed tariffs. A senior administration official told the Wall Street Journal Friday that the expanded China tariffs are coming but said that the timing remains unclear. Each round of new tariffs has been strongly opposed by U.S. tech companies. In a letter to U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, Apple said the proposed 25% tariff on $200 billion of Chinese imports would cover a wide range of Apple products and said the burden of the proposed tariffs will fall much more heavily on the U.S. and on China. Several tech giants, including Intel Corp. and Cisco Systems Inc., are seeking to persuade the U.S. Trade Representative to drop the proposed tariffs on imported products they say could cost the U.S. leadership in fifth-generation wireless technology. $200 BN? Make that $467 BN. Trump threatens to balloon proposed bonus China tech tariffs. Manufacturers, and ultimately U.S. citizens, will pay the price. U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening to tack import duties on $267 BN of imported Chinese tech gear and other goods on top of the $200 BN already planned. The president told reporters aboard Air Force One on Friday that he may expand his proposed tariffs as part of his ongoing trade war with China, in which the two nations ramp up costs on each other's exports. In short, the White House is mulling slapping tariffs on $200 BN of Chinese kit imported into the states, and the commander-in-chief is suggesting ballooning that figure to $467 BN. This comes after extra charges were whacked on $50 BN of certain components coming into America from the Middle Kingdom. These extra costs have to be borne by someone American manufacturers, importers, and/or citizens buying the final products. The idea is to put off folks buying Chinese goods in favor of us homegrown kit. The $200 BN we are talking about could take place very soon depending on what happens with them. To a certain extent it is going to be up to China, Trump was quoted as saying. And I hate to say this, but behind that is another $267 BN ready to go on short notice if I want. Earlier this year, the Trump administration imposed a package of tariffs on $50 BN of incoming Chinese-made parts used for aerospace, information and communication technology, and machinery. Among the equipment hit were a number of components and devices used by U.S. tech firms, including chips and networking gear produced in Chinese factories. Talk of the bonus $267 BN tariff package comes as the White House has yet to settle all of the specifics of the planned $200 BN tariff proposals which, as we said, would follow up that earlier $50 BN package. Speaking in a television interview, White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow said that the administration would be reviewing the roughly 6,000 comments members of the public had made to the U.S. Trade Representative on the $200 BN proposals before deciding on how to proceed with the tariffs. We will evaluate the comments, and we will make a decision, Kudlow said, suggesting it could be some time before the fresh import charges will be levied. Tech companies are also weighing in, with HPE, Cisco, Dell, and Juniper penning a letter to U.S. Trade Rep Robert Lighthizer asking him to hold off on imposing additional tariffs on networking gear, arguing the penalties would only serve to hurt their business in the U.S. If USTR Lighthizer were to impose a 10 to 25% additional duty on networking products and accessories, the Corps wrote, it would cause broad, disproportionate economic harm to U.S. interests, including our companies and U.S. workers, our customers, U.S. consumers, and broader U.S. economic and strategic priorities.